The clock on the bookstore wall showed 9:47 p.m. when Tyler finally closed the register for the last time that night. He had been working at Pages and Dreams bookstore for 8 months now, and it was the perfect job for a college student. The pay wasn't amazing, but his manager, Mrs. Chun, was understanding about his class schedule, and he genuinely loved being around books. Tyler pulled his navy blue hoodie over his head as he stepped out into the cool October evening the air had. That crisp feeling that reminded him fall was really here. He locked the store's front door and tested the handle twice, just like Mrs. Chun had taught him on his first day. She trusted him with the closing duties, and he never wanted to let her down. The walk home usually took him about 15 minutes through the quiet residential streets of Millbrook Heights. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still left their porch lights on and kids could ride their bikes after dinner without parents worrying too much. Tyler had grown up just 2 streets over from where he worked, and he knew every shortcut and side path in the area. As he started walking, Tyler pulled out his phone and saw 3 text messages from his girlfriend Jessica. She was asking about their plans for Saturday night. There was a new movie playing at the theater downtown, and she wanted to know if he was still interested in going. Tyler smiled as he typed back, telling her he'd already bought the tickets online during his lunch break. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk as Tyler made his way down Maple Street. A few houses still had their windows glowing with warm yellow light, and he could see families inside watching TV or cleaning up after dinner. It reminded him of his own childhood, when his dad would come home from the naval base and they'd all sit together to watch the evening news. His father, Commander Robert Williams, was currently deployed overseas, but they video called every Sunday morning. Tyler was proud of his dad's service, though he worried about him constantly. Growing up as a military kid had taught Tyler discipline and respect, values that served him well in college and at work. Tyler paused at the corner of Maple and Oak Street to let a car pass. The driver waved at him through the window, probably recognizing him from the neighborhood. That was one thing Tyler loved about living here. People still knew each other. His mom often joked that she couldn't go to the grocery store without running into at least 3 people she knew. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his study group reminding him about their chemistry exam on Thursday. Tyler made a mental note to review his notes when he got home. College was challenging, but he was determined to keep his grades up. He wanted to make his parents proud, especially his father, who had always emphasized the importance of education. As Tyler continued walking, he noticed how quiet the street was tonight. Usually there were a few people out walking their dogs or teenagers hanging out in front of the corner store. But tonight the neighborhood felt almost empty. The only sounds were his footsteps on the pavement and the distant hum of air conditioning. Units. 2 blocks from his house, Tyler stopped to tie his shoelace. As he bent down, his phone slipped out of his hoodie pocket and clattered onto the sidewalk. The screen lit up with another message from Jessica, this one with a funny meme about their chemistry professor. Tyler chuckled as he picked up the phone and continued walking. He was thinking about the weekend ahead when he noticed bright lights suddenly illuminating the street behind him. Tyler assumed it was just another car coming down the road, maybe someone coming home late from work. He stepped slightly to the right to give the vehicle more room to pass, just like his father had taught him when he was learning to walk safely in their neighborhood, but the lights didn't pass by. Instead, they seemed to be following him, getting brighter and brighter. Tyler glanced over his shoulder and saw it was a police car moving slowly behind him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars patrolled the neighborhood regularly, and Officer Martinez, who lived 3 houses down from Tyler's family, often waved when he saw Tyler walking home from work. Tyler continued walking at his normal pace, figuring the police car would either pass by or turn onto another street. He was almost home now, just 1 more block to go. He could see the warm glow of his front porch light in the distance, the one his mother always left on for him when he worked late shifts. As he reached for his house keys in his pocket, Tyler heard car doors slamming behind him. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet night air. He turned around. expecting to see Officer Martinez or maybe another friendly face from the neighborhood police force. Instead, he saw two officers he didn't recognize walking quickly toward him. Their hands were near their belts, and their faces looked tense and serious. Tyler felt a flutter of confusion in his stomach. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home from work like he did every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night. "Good evening, officers," Tyler said politely, the way his father had always taught him to address law enforcement. He stopped, walking, and faced them, keeping his hands visible like his dad had shown him during their conversations about staying safe. But something felt different about this encounter. The officers weren't smiling or making casual conversation like Officer Martinez usually did. Their body language seemed aggressive, almost like they were approaching a dangerous situation instead of talking to a college student. Walking home from his job at the local bookstore, Tyler's mind raced as he tried to figure out what might have happened. Had there been a break-in nearby? Was someone looking for a suspect who matched his description? He wanted to ask the officers if everything was okay, but something in their demeanor made him hesitate. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Morrison, kept his hand near his weapon while the shorter one, Coleman, moved to Tyler's right side. Tyler felt increasingly uncomfortable as he realized they were positioning themselves around him like he was some kind of threat. "Is there a problem, officers?" Tyler asked, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. His father had always told him that staying calm and cooperative was the best way to handle any interaction with police. Tyler's phone buzzed in his hand with another text from Jessica, probably wondering why he hadn't responded to her last message. The screen's blue light seemed unusually bright in the darkness of the street. He was only 50 yards from his front door now, so close to the safety and warmth of home. What Tyler didn't know was that earlier that evening, someone had called 911 to report a suspicious person walking through the neighborhood. The caller, Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over, had seen a young man in a hoodie walking past her house and decided he didn't belong in the area. She had no real reason for her suspicion. Other than her own prejudices and fears, the two officers responding to the call had their own troubling histories that Tyler knew nothing about. Both had previous complaints filed against them for excessive force, but those complaints had been buried in paperwork and never properly investigated. Tonight, they were looking for any excuse to justify their aggressive approach to what should have been a routine community interaction. As Tyler stood there in the glow of the streetlight, holding his phone and house keys, he had no idea that his ordinary Tuesday night was about to become a nightmare that would change his family's life forever. Officer Morrison and Officer Coleman stepped out of their patrol car with a sense of purpose that felt all wrong for the quiet residential street. They had been partners for 3 years, and in that time they had developed a dangerous pattern of seeing threats where none existed. Tonight was no different. Morrison, the senior officer, had been on the force for 12 years. He had a reputation among his colleagues for being tough on crime, but what that really meant was that he often escalated situations that could have been resolved with simple conversation. His personnel file contained 7 complaints about excessive force, but each one had been dismissed or quietly swept under the rug by supervisors who valued loyalty over accountability. Coleman was younger, only 5 years on the force, but he had quickly learned to follow Morrison's lead. He told himself that his partner's experience made him a good teacher, but deep down, Coleman knew that some of their encounters crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Still, he stayed quiet, more afraid of being labeled a troublemaker than standing up for what was right. As they approached Tyler, neither officer made any attempt to identify themselves or explain why they had stopped him. This was their first mistake, but it wouldn't be their last. Tyler stood under the streetlight, his phone still glowing in his hand, completely unaware of the danger he was in. "Put your hands where we can see them," Morrison barked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet night air like a knife. The command came without warning, without explanation, and with an aggression that immediately made Tyler's heart start racing. Tyler's mind went blank for a moment. He had been expecting a friendly conversation, maybe questions about whether he had seen anything unusual in the neighborhood. Instead, he was being treated like a criminal. His father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him to stay calm and follow instructions, no matter how confusing or frightening the situation became. "Yes, sir," Tyler said, slowly raising both hands. His phone was still in his right hand, and his house keys were in his left. The blue light from his phone screen cast strange shadows on his face as he held his hands up where the officers could see them, but instead of de-escalating the situation, Morrison seemed to become more agitated. His hand moved to rest on his service weapon, and his eyes darted around as if he expected danger to emerge from the shadows at any moment. In his mind, he was already constructing a narrative that would justify whatever happened next. "Drop whatever you're holding, Coleman," shouted from Tyler's right side. His voice was shaky, betraying his nervousness, but that nervousness made him more dangerous, not less. A scared officer with poor training was exactly the kind of person who made fatal mistakes. Tyler immediately let go of both his phone and his keys. The phone hit the concrete with a sharp crack, and the keys jingled as they scattered across the sidewalk. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet neighborhood, and Tyler could see lights starting to come on in nearby houses as residents wondered what was happening outside. "Don't move," Morrison commanded, even though Tyler was standing perfectly still with his hands raised. The contradiction didn't seem to register with either officer. They were operating on adrenaline and prejudice now, not logic or proper police procedure. Tyler tried to speak calmly. "Officers, I live right there," he said, nodding toward his house just 50 yards away. "I was just walking home from work. Is there something wrong?" His question was reasonable, his tone was respectful, and his body language showed no signs of aggression or resistance. Any properly trained officer would have recognized that Tyler posed no threat whatsoever. But Morrison and Coleman weren't thinking like properly trained officers. They were thinking like men who had been taught to see young people like Tyler as automatic threats. "Shut up," Coleman snapped. "Keep your mouth shut and don't move." The irony was bitter. Tyler was doing exactly what the officers had told him to do, yet they continued to treat him as if he were resisting arrest. His compliance seemed to make them more suspicious, not less. It was as if they had expected him to run or fight, and his cooperation was somehow throwing off their script. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house directly across from where this encounter was taking place, had been watching from her bedroom window since she heard the car doors slam. She was a retired school teacher who had taught Tyler in the 3rd grade, and she couldn't understand why police officers were treating him like a dangerous criminal. She reached for her phone to record what was happening, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Back on the street, Morrison was studying Tyler's face under the streetlight. In his twisted perspective, he saw defiance where there was only confusion, aggression where there was only fear. His 12 years of poor training, an unconscious bias had programmed him to interpret Tyler's presence in this neighborhood as inherently suspicious. "He's reaching for something," Morrison suddenly announced, even though Tyler's hands were clearly visible and empty above his head. Coleman's head snapped toward Tyler, his hand moving to his weapon. "Where? I don't see anything." But Morrison was already committed to his false narrative. "His waistband. He's going for his waistband." Tyler's blood turned to ice. He could hear the accusation in Morrison's voice, and he knew instinctively that his life was now in serious danger. His hands were still raised above his head, exactly where the officers could see them, but somehow that didn't seem to matter. "Anymore, my hands are up," Tyler said desperately. "Look, my hands are up. I'm not reaching for anything." But the officers weren't listening to his words. They were trapped in a cycle of escalation that they had created themselves, and now they couldn't find a way out without admitting they had made a mistake. For men like Morrison and Coleman, admitting mistakes wasn't an option. The next few seconds felt like hours to Tyler. He could see Morrison's hand on his weapon, could see Coleman moving into position, could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing down on him like a physical force. The streetlight above him flickered once, casting dancing shadows on the pavement below, dotting houses around the neighborhood. More lights were coming on. People were looking out their windows, sensing that something was wrong but not yet understanding the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Mrs. Chun," Tyler's boss from the bookstore, lived 2 blocks away and had just finished watching the late news when she heard raised voices outside. Tyler thought about his mother, probably asleep in their house just yards away, completely unaware that her son was in mortal danger. He thought about his father, thousands of miles away, serving his country, trusting that his son was safe in the neighborhood where he had grown up. He thought about Jessica, probably still waiting for him to respond to her text messages about their weekend plans. Morrison drew his weapon first, followed immediately by Coleman. 2 guns were now pointed at an unarmed college student whose only crime was walking home from his job at a bookstore. "He's got a weapon," Morrison shouted, even though no weapon existed. "I see it too," Coleman confirmed, backing up his partners. Even though he saw nothing in Tyler's empty hands, Tyler's world exploded into chaos as the first shots rang out across the quiet residential street, shattering the peace of the neighborhood and forever changing the lives of everyone who lived there. Commander Robert Williams was sitting in his temporary office at the Overseas Naval Base, reviewing intelligence reports for the next morning's mission briefing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he studied maps and tactical positions, his mind focused on keeping his team safe during their upcoming operation. It was 3:47 a.m. local time, but sleep had become a luxury he rarely enjoyed during deployment. His phone sat silent on the metal desk beside a cold cup of coffee and a framed photo of his family. The picture showed him, his wife Linda, and Tyler. At Tyler's high school graduation just 2 years ago, Tyler was wearing his cap and gown, grinning widely as he held his diploma. Robert remembered feeling so proud that day, knowing his son had grown into a responsible young man despite the challenges of being a military kid. The base was quiet except for the usual sounds of night operations. Robert could hear boots walking past his door in the hallway, probably the midnight security patrol making their rounds. In a few hours, the place would be buzzing with activity as preparations began for another day of missions. But right now, the silence gave him time to think. About home, he missed his family terribly. Video calls every Sunday helped, but they couldn't replace the feeling of being there for the important moments. He had already missed Tyler's first year of college, Linda's birthday, and countless family dinners. The sacrifice was worth it for his country and his career, but it never stopped hurting. Robert glanced at his watch and calculated the time difference. Back home, Tyler would be getting ready to close the bookstore soon. Robert smiled, thinking about how responsible his son had become. When Tyler first got the job, Robert had worried it might interfere with his studies. But Tyler had proven he could handle both work and school without any problems. The secure phone on his desk rang suddenly, cutting through the quiet night like an alarm. Robert frowned as he looked at the caller ID. It was his wife Linda's number, but it was the middle of the night back home. She never called at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. "Linda?" Robert answered immediately, his military training already putting him on high alert. "What's wrong?" The sound of his wife's voice hit him like a physical blow. She was crying so hard she could barely speak, her words coming out in broken sobs that made his heart race with terror. "Robert, oh God, Robert ... or they shot Tyler ... The words didn't make sense at first. Robert's mind rejected them, searching for some other explanation for what his wife was trying to tell him. Tyler was just a college kid walking home from work. Who would shoot Tyler? "Linda, slow down," Robert said, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "What happened? Where are you?" "I'm at the hospital," Linda managed between sobs. "The police ... they shot him. They said he had a weapon, but he didn't." "Robert, he's in surgery and they don't know." Robert felt the room spinning around him. 15 years of military service had prepared him for many things, but nothing had prepared him for this phone call. His son, his only child, had been shot by police officers. The boy who helped elderly neighbors carry their groceries, who volunteered at the local animal shelter, who had never been in trouble a day in his life. "I'm coming home," Robert said immediately, his mind already shifting into crisis mode. "I'm getting on the first flight out of here. Which hospital?" Linda gave him the details through her tears. St. Mary's Hospital, room 412 in the surgical wing. The doctors had said the next few hours were critical. Tyler had been shot multiple times and had lost a lot of blood. They were doing everything they could, but they couldn't make any promises after hanging up. Robert sat in stunned silence for exactly 30 seconds, allowing himself that brief moment to process the devastating news. Then his military training kicked in completely. He picked up his desk phone and called his commanding officer, briefly explaining the emergency and requesting immediate leave. Within minutes, he was approved for emergency family leave and transportation to the nearest airport. As Robert packed his essential belongings, his hands shook for the first time in years. He had been in combat situations, had faced enemy fire, had made life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. But nothing had ever terrified him like the thought of losing his son. The flight home felt endless. Robert sat in the military transport plane, staring out the small window at the clouds below, trying to make sense of what had happened. Tyler was the kind of kid who followed rules, who respected authority, who had been raised to always cooperate with police officers. How could a simple walk home from work have turned into a shooting? During the long hours in the air, Robert's mind raced through every conversation he had ever had with Tyler about staying safe. He had taught his son to keep his hands visible. During police encounters, to speak respectfully, to follow instructions without question. Tyler had done everything right. And somehow, it hadn't been enough. Robert thought about all the times he had defended law enforcement to friends and colleagues who complained about police behavior. He had always believed that good people who followed the law had nothing to fear from police officers. Now, his own son was fighting for his life, and Robert's faith in the system was crumbling with every mile that passed beneath the plane. When the plane finally landed, Robert barely remembered the taxi ride to the hospital. He ran through the lobby, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and found Linda sitting in the surgical waiting area. She looked like she had aged 10 years in one night. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, and she was clutching Tyler's phone, which the hospital staff had given her along with his other personal belongings. "Any news?" Robert asked as he wrapped his arms around his wife. "He's still in surgery," Linda whispered. "It's been 6 hours, Robert, 6 hours and no word." Robert held his wife as she cried, feeling helpless in a way he had never experienced. Before, on the battlefield, he could take action, make tactical decisions, fight back against threats. But here in this sterile hospital waiting room, all he could do was wait and hope that skilled surgeons could save his son's life. A detective approached them around dawn, introducing himself as Detective Martinez from the local police department. He was not the same Officer Martinez who lived in their neighborhood and had always been friendly with Tyler. This Martinez was from Internal Affairs, and he had questions about the shooting. "I need to ask you some questions about your son," Detective Martinez said, pulling out a notepad. The officers involved reported that Tyler was acting aggressively and appeared to be reaching for a weapon. "Can you think of any reason why he might have resisted arrest?" Robert stared at the detective in disbelief. "Resisted arrest?" Tyler wasn't under arrest. He was walking home from work. "And what weapon? Tyler doesn't own any weapons." "Well, the officers reported seeing something in his hand that they believed to be a weapon," Martinez continued. "Did Tyler have any history of mental health issues or drug use that might explain his behavior?" Robert felt his temper rising, but his military discipline kept his voice controlled. "Detective, my son is a college student with a part-time job at a bookstore. He has no criminal history, no mental health issues, and no involvement with drugs. He was walking home from work, just like he does 3 nights a week." The detective made notes, but Robert could tell the man had already made up his mind about what had happened. The official story was that Tyler had somehow threatened 2 armed police officers, and they had responded with justified force. It didn't matter that Tyler was unarmed or that he had been 50 yards from his own front door, or that he had no history of violence. As the detective walked away, Robert realized that this was just the beginning. The police department would investigate itself and find no wrongdoing. The officers would return to duty, and his family would be left to deal with the aftermath of a senseless shooting that should never have happened, but Robert Williams was. Not just any father. He was a Navy SEAL commander with 15 years of experience in tactical operations and investigation. If the system wouldn't find the truth, he would find it himself. 3 days had passed since Tyler was shot, and he was finally stable enough to be moved from intensive care to a regular hospital room. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive, but the word lucky felt like a cruel joke to Robert. His son had bullet wounds in his chest and shoulder, would need months of physical therapy, and would carry scars for the rest of his life. There was nothing lucky about any of it. Robert had barely slept since arriving at the hospital. When he wasn't sitting by Tyler's bedside, he was pacing the hallways or making phone calls to military contacts who might be able to help him understand what had really happened that night. His wife, Linda, was exhausted too, but she refused to leave Tyler's side except for quick trips to get coffee or use the bathroom. On the morning of the 4th day, Tyler was finally awake long enough to have a real conversation. His voice was weak and raspy from the breathing tube, but his memory of the shooting was crystal clear. Robert sat beside the hospital bed, holding his son's hand as Tyler described those terrifying moments on the street. "Dad, I did everything. You taught me," Tyler whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "I kept my hands visible. I spoke respectfully. I didn't make any sudden movements, but they kept yelling at me like I was dangerous. I couldn't understand what I had done wrong." Robert felt his heart breaking all over again as he listened to his son's account. Tyler described how the officers had never identified themselves, never explained why they had stopped him, never tried to have a normal conversation. They had treated him like a criminal from the very first moment, even though he was just a college student walking home from work. "They said I had a weapon, Dad. They kept shouting that I was reaching for something, but my hands were up the whole time. The only things I had were my phone and my house keys, and I dropped those as soon as they told me to." Robert squeezed his son's hand gently. "I believe you, Tyler, and I'm going to find out exactly what happened that night." That afternoon, while Linda stayed with Tyler, Robert drove back to their neighborhood to begin his own investigation. He had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, and he knew how to gather intelligence and piece together the truth from incomplete information. If the police department wasn't going to conduct a real investigation, he would do it himself. Robert started by walking the exact route Tyler had taken home from the bookstore. He timed the walk, noting every streetlight, every security camera, every potential witness who might have seen what happened. The route was simple and direct, through a safe residential area where Tyler had walked hundreds of times before. When Robert reached the spot where Tyler had been shot, he was surprised to find flowers and cards that neighbors had left. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had organized a small memorial, and people from the community had been stopping by all week to leave messages of support for Tyler's recovery. "Commander Williams," Mrs. Patterson called out as she saw him examining the scene. She was a retired schoolteacher who had known Tyler since he was 8 years old. "I'm so sorry about what happened to Tyler. I want you to know that I saw the whole thing." Robert's pulse quickened. "You witnessed the shooting?" "Every second of it," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I was watching from my bedroom window when those officers got out of their car. Tyler wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just standing there with his hands up, trying to answer their questions. And, Commander, I recorded part of it on my phone." Robert felt a surge of hope for the first time since receiving that terrible phone call. A witness with video evidence could change everything. Mrs. Patterson invited him into her house and showed him the footage she had captured on her cell phone. The video was shaky and taken from a distance, but it clearly showed Tyler with his hands raised, standing perfectly still while the officers pointed their weapons at him. "The police never asked me for this video," Mrs. Patterson said. "In fact, when I tried to talk to them at the scene, they told me to go back inside and mind my own business. But I think you should have it." Mrs. Patterson transferred the video to Robert's phone, and he immediately recognized its importance. The footage contradicted the officers' claims that Tyler had been aggressive or threatening. It showed a young man following instructions and trying to cooperate with police who seemed determined to treat him as a dangerous criminal. Robert spent the rest of the day canvassing the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have information about the shooting. He discovered that at least 4 other neighbors had witnessed parts of the encounter, but none of them had been interviewed by the police investigators. Even more troubling, he learned that the officers had instructed witnesses to move along and forget what they saw immediately after the shooting at the corner store where Tyler sometimes bought snacks after work. Robert met Mr. Kim, the owner, who had his own security camera system. Mr. Kim had known Tyler for years and was devastated by what had happened. He was more than willing to help Robert by providing footage from his cameras, which had a clear view of the street where the shooting occurred. "Tyler is good boy," Mr. Kim said as he copied the security footage onto a flash drive. "Always polite, always says thank you. What happened to him is wrong, very wrong." The security camera footage was even more damning than Mrs. Patterson's cell phone video. It showed the entire encounter from beginning to end, clearly documenting that Tyler never reached for anything, never made threatening gestures, and never tried to run or resist. The officers had shot an unarmed young man who was fully cooperating with their commands. Robert also discovered something else troubling during his investigation. He learned that Officer Morrison and Officer Coleman had been involved in 3 other controversial incidents over the past 2 years. In each case, they had used excessive force against young people in the community, and in each case, the complaints had been dismissed or buried in paperwork. One incident involved a high school student who had been tackled and arrested for jaywalking. Another involved a college-age woman who had been roughly handcuffed for talking back during a routine traffic stop. The third incident involved a young man who had been pepper sprayed for suspicious behavior while waiting for a bus. All of the victims were young, and all of them had been treated with unnecessary aggression. Robert realized that Tyler's shooting wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior by officers who seemed to have a particular problem with young people in the community. The police department knew about these officers' history, but they had done nothing to retrain them or remove them from street duty. That evening, Robert sat in his kitchen reviewing all the evidence he had gathered. He had witness statements, video footage from multiple angles, and documentation of the officers' previous misconduct. It was more evidence than most criminal cases ever had, and it painted a clear picture of what had really happened that night. But Robert also knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. The police department would try to suppress the videos, discredit the witnesses, and protect their officers at all costs. The local prosecutor would be reluctant to charge police officers, especially when the police union and political establishment were pressuring him to support law enforcement. Robert picked up his phone and called his old friend Captain Johnson, who had served with him in Afghanistan and now worked at the Pentagon. Robert explained the situation and asked for advice on how to navigate the civilian justice system. "Robert, you're dealing with a completely different kind of warfare here," Captain Johnson warned him. "The enemy isn't wearing uniforms, and the rules of engagement are designed to protect them, not you. You're going to need legal help, media support, and political pressure if you want justice for Tyler." As Robert hung up the phone, he realized that his real mission was just beginning. He had uncovered the truth about what happened to his son, but now he had to figure out how to force a corrupt system to acknowledge that truth and hold the responsible officers accountable. Chief Patricia Henderson had been running the Millbrook Heights Police Department for 8 years, and she had seen her share of controversial incidents. But the shooting of Tyler Williams was different. This wasn't some anonymous troublemaker from the wrong side of town. This was a college student from a respected military family, shot just yards from his own front door in the safest neighborhood in the city, the morning after Robert completed his neighborhood investigation. Chief Henderson sat in her office reviewing the incident reports that Morrison and Coleman had filed. Their stories were full of dramatic language about a dangerous suspect who had aggressively confronted them and reached for what appeared to be a weapon. Reading their reports, someone might think they had barely survived an encounter with a hardened criminal, but Henderson knew these officers and she knew their history. She had personally buried 3 previous complaints against Morrison for excessive force, and she had helped Coleman avoid suspension twice for similar incidents. They were her problem officers, the ones who generated paperwork and headaches. But they were also loyal to her, and the department. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Mayor Davidson's office, and Henderson knew this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. The mayor had been fielding calls from concerned citizens all morning, and he wanted answers about why 2 of her officers had shot an unarmed college student. "Patricia, what the hell happened out there?" Mayor Davidson demanded as soon as she answered. "I've got reporters calling, I've got the city council asking questions, and I've got that kid's father asking for meetings. This is turning into a public relations nightmare." Henderson had expected this call. Mayor Davidson was primarily concerned with his own political survival, and a police shooting in a quiet residential neighborhood was exactly the kind of scandal that could end careers. She needed to convince him that the department could handle this internally without outside interference. "Mr. Mayor, I understand your concerns," Henderson said carefully. But my officers were responding to a legitimate call about suspicious activity. They followed proper procedures and used appropriate force when the suspect failed to comply with lawful orders. It was the standard language that police departments use to justify questionable shootings. Henderson had used these exact phrases dozens of times before, and they usually worked to shut down further inquiry. But this case felt different, and she could sense the mayor's skepticism through the phone. "Patricia, I need you to understand something," Mayor Davidson said. "The kid's father is a Navy SEAL commander. He's not some grieving parent who's going to quietly accept whatever story you tell him. He's trained in investigation and he has military connections. If we try to cover this up and he proves we're lying, we're all finished." Henderson felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't realized that Tyler's father had military intelligence training. That changed everything. Most families of shooting victims had to rely on overworked public defenders or pro bono lawyers who couldn't match the resources of the police department. But a Navy SEAL commander would have skills, connections, and determination that could pose a real threat to their standard cover-up procedures. After hanging up with the mayor, Henderson called Lieutenant Brooks, her head of internal affairs. Brooks was a career administrator who understood that his job was to protect the department's reputation, not to find the truth about officer misconduct. He had a perfect record of clearing officers in controversial shootings, and Henderson needed him to work his magic again. "I need you to expedite the Williams investigation," Henderson told Brooks, "and I need the result to be a clean shooting. Morrison and Coleman were justified in their use of force, and I want your report to reflect that clearly." Brooks understood. "The assignment. What about the witness statements? I've heard there might be some neighbors who saw the incident." "Handle it," Henderson said curtly. "Find reasons to discredit any witnesses who contradict our officer's version of events, and make sure the physical evidence supports our narrative." Over the next few days, Brooks began his orchestrated investigation. He interviewed Morrison and Coleman first, allowing them to coordinate their stories and rehearse their testimony. He made sure their union representative was present during questioning, and he avoided asking any challenging questions that might expose inconsistencies in their accounts. When Brooks finally got around to interviewing neighbors, he approached them with obvious skepticism about their recollections. Mrs. Patterson, who had recorded part of the shooting on her phone, was told that her video was too unclear to be useful and that her memory of events was probably distorted by the stress of witnessing violence. "Ma'am, you have to understand that these situations happen very quickly," Brooks explained to Mrs. Patterson in a condescending tone. "What you think you saw might not be what actually happened. Our officers are trained professionals who know how to assess threats. They wouldn't have used their weapons unless it was absolutely necessary." When Mrs. Patterson insisted that Tyler had never appeared threatening, Brooks made notes suggesting that she was biased in favor of the Williams family and couldn't be considered a reliable witness. He used similar tactics with other neighbors, questioning their ability to see clearly in the dark, their understanding of police procedures, and their motives for contradicting the officers' accounts. Meanwhile, Henderson was working her own connections in the local media. She had cultivated relationships with several reporters over the years, feeding them stories that made the police department look good and ensuring favorable coverage when controversies arose. Now, she needed those relationships to control the narrative about Tyler's shooting. She called Jack Morrison, a veteran reporter at the local newspaper who had always been friendly to law enforcement. Morrison wasn't related to Officer Morrison. The shared last name was just an unfortunate coincidence that sometimes confused people. But Jack Morrison had built his career by maintaining good relationships with police sources, and he rarely wrote stories that criticized the department. "Jack, I wanted to give you the inside story on the Williams shooting before other reporters start spreading misinformation," Henderson said during their lunch meeting at a quiet restaurant downtown. "My officers responded to a legitimate complaint about suspicious activity, and they were forced to defend themselves when the suspect became aggressive." Jack Morrison took careful notes as Henderson fed him the department's version of events. She painted Tyler as a troubled young man who had somehow provoked two experienced officers into using deadly force. She emphasized the officers' years of service and their previous commendations, while subtly suggesting that Tyler might have been involved in criminal activity that his family didn't know about. "Between you and me, Jack, we're looking into whether this kid was involved with drugs or gangs," Henderson said, even though she knew there was no evidence to support such claims. Good families sometimes don't know what their children are really doing when they're away from home. The resulting news article was exactly what Henderson had hoped for. Jack Morrison's story portrayed the shooting as a tragic but necessary use of force by dedicated officers who had been put in an impossible situation by Tyler's alleged threatening behavior. The article included quotes from Henderson praising Morrison and Coleman's professionalism, while only briefly mentioning that Tyler remained hospitalized with serious injuries. But Henderson's media strategy had one major flaw. She had underestimated Robert Williams and his determination to get the truth about his son's shooting. While she was busy controlling the local narrative, Robert was building his own case with evidence that would be much harder to discredit than witness testimony. Robert had spent the week since gathering his evidence making copies of everything and storing them in multiple secure locations. He had learned from his military experience never to rely on a single source or storage method when dealing with sensitive intelligence. The videos from Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Kim's security cameras were now backed up on encrypted drives and stored with trusted friends who lived outside the city. Robert had also been making phone calls to contacts in Washington who understood how local corruption worked and how to combat it. He was learning that police departments had well-established playbooks for covering up officer misconduct, but they also had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood their tactics. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Tyler's shooting, Robert received a call from Lieutenant Brooks requesting a meeting to discuss the internal affairs investigation. Brooks explained that the department wanted to hear the family's concerns and ensure that they felt their voices were being heard in the investigative process. Robert agreed to the meeting, but he wasn't naive about its purpose. He knew that Brooks was hoping to gauge how much evidence the family had gathered, and whether they would accept the department's predetermined conclusion that the shooting was justified. It would be Robert's first direct confrontation with the system that was trying to protect the officers who had nearly killed his son. Robert walked into the police station on Friday morning with the confidence of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for battles. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and Lieutenant Brooks wasn't an enemy combatant. This was a different kind of warfare, one where the rules were designed to protect his opponents and where his military training might not be enough to secure victory. The meeting with Brooks took place in a sterile conference room with fluorescent lighting and beige walls. Brooks sat across from Robert with a thick file folder in front of him, trying to project authority and control. He had conducted hundreds of these meetings with families of people who had been hurt by police officers, and he knew exactly how to manage grieving relatives who wanted answers. "Commander Williams, I want to start by saying how sorry we all are about what happened to Tyler," Brooks began, using the sympathetic tone he had perfected over years of practice. No parent should have to go through what you and your wife are experiencing right now. Robert studied Brooks carefully, noting his body language and choice of words. Brooks was treating Tyler's shooting like a natural disaster or an unavoidable accident rather than the result of specific decisions made by specific officers. It was a classic deflection technique, and Robert recognized it immediately. "Lieutenant Brooks, I'm not here for sympathy," Robert said calmly. "I'm here for facts. I want to know exactly what happened that night, and I want to know what you're doing to ensure it never happens again." Brooks opened his file folder and pulled out the incident reports written by Morrison and Coleman. "Based on our preliminary investigation, your son was stopped because of a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. When officers attempted to question him, he became agitated and appeared to reach for something that could have been a weapon. The officers had no choice but to defend themselves." Robert had expected this version of events, but hearing it spoken aloud still made his blood pressure rise. Every word of Brooks' summary contradicted what Tyler had told him and what the witnesses had described. It was a complete fabrication designed to justify an unjustifiable shooting. "Lieutenant, my son was unarmed," Robert said, keeping his voice steady despite his anger. "He was walking home from work, just like he does 3 nights a week. He had no weapon, made no threatening moves, and posed no danger to anyone." Brooks consulted his notes, pretending to take Robert's concerns seriously. "I understand that's what your family believes, Commander, but sometimes family members have difficulty accepting the reality of these situations. Your son may not have told you the complete truth about what happened that night. It was exactly the wrong thing to say to a Navy SEAL, commander whose son had been shot while following the safety protocols that Robert himself had taught him." Robert leaned forward slightly, his military bearing making Brooks unconsciously shrink back in his chair. "Lieutenant, are you suggesting that my son is lying about being shot while his hands were raised in compliance with police commands?" Brooks realized he had made a mistake, but he couldn't back down without undermining the department's entire narrative. "What I'm saying is that these situations are complex, and witnesses often see what they want to see rather than what actually happened." Robert reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet computer. He had spent the previous evening editing together the various video clips he had obtained from Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Kim's security system. The result was a clear, undeniable record of what had actually happened that night. "Lieutenant, I think you should see this," Robert said, sliding the tablet across the table. "This is security footage from multiple angles showing exactly what happened when your officers shot my son." Brooks looked at the screen with growing horror as the video played. It showed Tyler walking peacefully down the street, stopping when the police car appeared, raising his hands immediately when commanded, and standing perfectly still with his hands visible above his head when the officers opened fire. There was no reaching for weapons, no aggressive behavior, no justification for the use of deadly force. "Where did you get this?" Brooks demanded, his professional composure finally cracking. "From concerned citizens who witnessed the shooting and wanted to make sure the truth came out," Robert replied. "Citizens who, by the way, were never interviewed by your department during this so-called investigation." Brooks was panicking now, realizing that the department's carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. The video evidence was clear and undeniable, and it made Morrison and Coleman look like either liars or incompetent officers who had nearly murdered an innocent young man. "This video could be edited or taken out of context," Brooks said desperately. "We would need to have our technical experts examine it to determine its authenticity." Robert smiled for the first time since entering the police station. "I'm sure you would. But I've already had the footage authenticated by military digital forensics experts. I also have the original files with timestamps and metadata that prove they haven't been altered in any way." While Brooks struggled to process this devastating blow to his investigation, Robert continued his methodical dismantling of the department's case. He pulled out witness statements he had collected himself, photographs of the scene that contradicted the officers' claims, and documentation of Morrison and Coleman's history of excessive force complaints. "Lieutenant, I spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL conducting investigations in hostile territory," Robert said as he laid out document after document. I know how to gather evidence, verify sources, and build an airtight case. What I've discovered is that your officers shot an unarmed young man without justification, and your department is now engaged in a systematic cover-up to protect them. Brooks was completely out of his depth. He had expected to intimidate a grieving father into accepting the department's version of events. Instead, he was facing a trained military investigator who had uncovered evidence that could destroy the careers of multiple police officers and administrators. Commander Williams, I think we need to schedule a follow-up meeting, Brooks said, trying to buy time to consult with Chief Henderson and the police union lawyers. I need to review all of this new information with my supervisors. There won't be any follow-up meetings, Robert said, standing up and collecting his evidence. I'm done trying to work within your department's corrupt system. From now on, you'll be hearing from federal investigators. That afternoon, Robert made a series of phone calls to contacts he had developed during his military career. The first call went to Agent Jennifer Chun at the FBI's Civil Rights Division, who specialized in investigating police misconduct cases. Robert had worked with Agent Chun on a joint task force 3 years earlier, and he knew she had the expertise and authority to bypass local corruption. Bob, I heard about what happened to Tyler through the military network, Agent Chun said when Robert called. I've been waiting for you to reach out. Send me everything you've got, and I'll open a federal civil rights investigation immediately. Robert's second call went to Colonel David Martinez at the Pentagon, who had connections throughout the Department of Justice. Colonel Martinez had served under Robert in Afghanistan and owed him a significant favor after Robert's quick thinking had saved his unit during a Taliban ambush. Robert, what those officers did to Tyler is unconscionable, Colonel Martinez said after Robert briefed him on the situation. I'm going to make some calls to people who can ensure this gets the attention it deserves at the highest levels of government. Robert's third call was to Master Chief Angela Thompson, who now worked as a congressional liaison for Navy Special Operations. Thompson had been Robert's partner on dozens of missions, and she understood better than anyone how to navigate the political system in Washington. Commander, you know I've got your back on this, Thompson said. I'm going to brief some key members of Congress who sit on judiciary and oversight committees. They need to know that local police departments are covering up the shooting of military families by the end of the day. Robert had set in motion a series of investigations that would bypass the local police department entirely. Federal agents would be reviewing the evidence, congressional staffers would be asking questions about patterns of police misconduct, and military networks would be applying pressure through channels that Chief Henderson and Lieutenant Brooks couldn't influence or control. That evening, Robert sat with Linda and Tyler in the hospital room, explaining what he had accomplished. Tyler was getting stronger every day, but he still tired easily and needed frequent rest. Linda had barely left his side since the shooting, and the stress was showing in every line of her face. Dad, do you really think we can get justice? Tyler asked. His voice still weak but filled with hope for the first time since the shooting. Robert took his son's hand and looked him in the eye. Tyler, I made a promise to myself the night you were shot. I promised that the officers who did this to you would be held accountable, and that we would make sure it never happens to another family. I've never broken a promise to you, and I'm not going to start now. Outside the hospital room, Robert's phone was already ringing with calls from federal investigators who wanted to review his evidence and begin building a case that would finally bring justice for T. 3 weeks after Robert's meeting with Lieutenant Brooks, FBI agent Jennifer Chun arrived in Millbrook Heights with a team of federal investigators. Unlike the local police department's superficial internal review, the FBI investigation would be thorough, independent, and focused on uncovering the truth rather than protecting corrupt officers. Agent Chun set up her command center in a conference room at the federal building downtown, away from any potential interference by local law enforcement. Her team included digital forensics experts, civil rights attorneys, and investigators who specialized in police misconduct cases. They had handled dozens of similar investigations across the country, and they knew exactly how local departments tried to cover up officer wrongdoing. The first person Agent Chun interviewed was Tyler himself. By now, he was strong enough to leave the hospital for short periods, though he still needed help walking and tired easily. Tyler sat in the federal building conference room with his parents beside him, finally able to tell his story to investigators who were genuinely interested in finding the truth. "Tyler, I want you to take your time and tell me exactly what happened that night," Agent Chun said gently. "Start from when you left work and walk me through every detail you can remember." Tyler's account was clear and consistent with everything Robert had discovered during his own investigation. He described walking home from the bookstore, being suddenly confronted by officers who never identified themselves or explained why they had stopped him, and being shot while his hands were raised in full compliance with their commands. "They kept yelling that I had a weapon," Tyler said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "But I never had anything except my phone and my house keys. I dropped those immediately when they told me to. I couldn't understand why they thought I was dangerous." Agent Chun made detailed notes and recorded the entire interview. Tyler's testimony would be crucial evidence in any federal prosecution, but she knew that witness testimony alone wouldn't be enough to convict police officers. She needed the video evidence that Robert had collected, and she needed to build a case that proved the officers had willfully violated Tyler's civil rights. The next phase of the investigation focused on the video footage from multiple sources. Agent Chun's digital forensics team confirmed what Robert already knew. The videos were authentic and unedited, showing clearly that Tyler had posed no threat to the officers when they opened fire. The footage was so damning that Agent Chun knew any jury would be outraged by what they saw, but Agent Chun also discovered something that even Robert hadn't uncovered during his investigation: the FBI's analysis of police radio communications from that night revealed that Morrison and Coleman had never reported seeing a weapon before they started shooting. Their radio chatter indicated they were responding to a suspicious person call, but there was no mention of any threats or aggressive behavior from Tyler. More disturbing was what the FBI found when they examined the officers' previous incidents. Morrison and Coleman had been involved in 11 questionable use of force incidents over the past 5 years. Not just the 3 that Robert had discovered. In each case, the police department had either dismissed the complaints or settled them quietly without any disciplinary action against the officers. Agent Chun realized she wasn't just investigating one bad shooting, she was uncovering a pattern of systematic abuse that the police department had been hiding for years. The evidence suggested that Morrison and Coleman had been given free rein to abuse citizens, particularly young people, with no fear of consequences. 2 months after the FBI investigation began, Agent Chen made her first arrests. Morrison and Coleman were taken into custody at their homes early on a Tuesday morning, charged with federal civil rights violations and conspiracy to deprive Tyler of his constitutional rights. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Chief Henderson was arrested the same morning, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice for her role in covering up the shooting and protecting officers with known histories of misconduct. Lieutenant Brooks was also arrested, facing charges related to his fraudulent internal investigation that had been designed to exonerate the officers rather than find the truth. The arrests sent shockwaves through the Millbrook Heights Police Department and the broader law enforcement community. It was rare for police officers to face federal charges, and even rarer for administrators to be held accountable for covering up officer misconduct. But Agent Chin's investigation had produced such overwhelming evidence that federal prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions. The story broke nationally when Robert decided to go public with his family's ordeal. He had been contacted by several major news networks who wanted to interview him about the case, and he realized that media attention could help ensure justice for Tyler, while also highlighting the broader problem of police accountability. Robert's first interview was with Sun En, where he appeared alongside Tyler, who was now walking with a cane but determined to tell his story. The interview aired on a Wednesday evening, and within hours, Video clips were spreading across social media platforms, generating millions of views and widespread outrage. "My son was shot for the crime of walking home from work," Robert said. During the interview, he followed every rule, respected the officer's authority, and tried to cooperate in every way possible. But none of that mattered because these officers had already decided he was guilty of something. The CNN interview was followed by appearances on other major networks, and soon the Tyler Williams case was being discussed on news programs across the country. The video footage that Robert had fought so hard to preserve was now being seen by millions of Americans, most of whom were horrified by what they witnessed. The public reaction was swift and intense. Protest demonstrations began in Millbrook Heights, with community members demanding not just justice for Tyler, but comprehensive reform of the police department. The protests were peaceful but persistent, with protesters gathering outside City Hall every day calling for accountability and change. Linda Williams found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for other families who had experienced police violence. She received calls and letters from parents across the country who had lost children to police shootings or who had family members injured by officer misconduct. Many of these families had never received justice because they lacked the resources and connections that Robert's military background had provided. "I never wanted to become an activist," Linda said during one interview. "I just wanted my son to recover and the officers who shot him to be held accountable. But now I realize that Tyler's case represents something much bigger than our family's personal tragedy." The media attention and public pressure began to have political consequences as well. Congressman Daniel Rodriguez, who represented the district that included Millbrook Heights, called for congressional hearings on police accountability and federal oversight of local law enforcement agencies. Senator Patricia Allen announced that she would introduce legislation requiring all police departments to report use-of-force incidents to a federal database. Mayor Davidson, facing intense criticism for his administration's initial support of the police department's cover-up, announced that he would not seek re-election. The City Council voted to hire an independent monitor to oversee police department operations and to implement new policies requiring body cameras for all officers and civilian oversight of internal investigations. But perhaps the most significant development came when the Department of Justice announced that it would conduct a comprehensive investigation of the entire Millbrook Heights Police Department. This pattern and practice investigation would examine whether the department had a history of civil rights violations and would potentially result in federal oversight of all police operations. Tyler, meanwhile, was making steady progress in his physical recovery. The doctor said he would always have some limitations from his injuries, but he was determined not to let the shooting define his life. He had decided to change his major from business to criminal justice, inspired by his family's fight for accountability and his desire to help reform the system that had nearly killed him. "I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else," Tyler said during a speech at his college. "I want to help create a world where young people can walk home from work without fear, where police officers are held to the same standards as everyone else, and where justice isn't just a word we say but something we actually achieve." As the federal prosecution moved forward, Robert knew that their fight was far from over. But for the first time since that terrible night when he received Linda's phone call, he believed that real justice was possible and that their struggle would create lasting change for other families facing similar tragedies. 18 months after that fateful night when Tyler was shot, the federal courthouse in downtown was packed with reporters, community members, and families who had traveled from across the country to witness what many hoped would be a turning point in police accountability. The trial of Officers Morrison and Coleman had lasted 6 weeks, and today the jury would deliver their verdict. Robert sat in the front row with Linda and Tyler, holding his wife's hand as they waited for the judge to call the court to order. Tyler walked into the courthouse on his own that morning, no longer needing the cane that had helped him during his recovery. His physical scars were still visible, but his determination to see justice done had only grown stronger over the months of legal proceedings. The jury had deliberated for 3 days, carefully reviewing hours of video evidence, witness testimony, an expert analysis of the shooting. Agent Chun had built a case so comprehensive that even the officers' expensive defense attorneys had struggled to create reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked as the 12 jurors filed back into the courtroom. We have, Your Honor, replied the jury foreman, a retired teacher who had been visibly moved by Tyler's testimony during the trial. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law against Officer Morrison, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The words seemed to echo through the packed courtroom. Robert felt Linda squeeze his hand tighter as they heard the verdict they had fought so hard to achieve. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law against Officer Coleman, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Tyler closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For 18 months, he had relived that night over and over again, wondering if justice would ever come. Now, finally, the two men who had nearly killed him would face consequences for their actions. The judge continued reading through the additional charges: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and filing false reports. Guilty verdicts on every count. Morrison and Coleman showed no emotion as they were handcuffed and led away to begin serving their federal prison sentences, which would range from 15 to 20 years each. Chief Henderson and Lieutenant Brooks had already been convicted. In separate trials earlier that year, Henderson received 12 years for her role in the cover-up conspiracy, while Brooks got 8 years for obstruction of justice. The message was clear: the federal government would no longer tolerate police departments that protected corrupt officers. Outside the courthouse, Robert addressed the crowd of supporters and media representatives who had gathered to hear the verdict. Tyler stood beside his father, no longer the frightened college student who had been shot while walking home from work, but a confident young man who had become a symbol of resilience and justice. Today's verdict won't undo what happened to my son, Robert said into the microphones. Tyler will always carry the scars from that night, and our family will never forget the trauma we endured. But this verdict sends a message that police officers are not above the law, and that families who seek justice will be heard. Tyler stepped forward to speak for himself. 18 months ago, I was shot for the crime of walking home from work in my own neighborhood. I almost died because 2 officers decided I was guilty of something before they even spoke to me. But today, justice was served, and I hope other families won't have to go through what we went through to get accountability. The convictions were just the beginning of the changes that swept through Millbrook Heights and beyond. The Department of Justice's investigation of the police department had revealed a culture of misconduct that went back decades. Federal monitors were now overseeing every aspect of police operations, from training programs to disciplinary procedures. The new police chief, brought in from outside the city, had implemented comprehensive reforms. Every officer now wore body cameras that automatically activated during any interaction with the public. A civilian oversight board reviewed all use-of-force incidents. Officers received extensive training on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. Most importantly, the department's entire approach to community policing had been transformed. Instead of viewing young people as automatic threats, officers were trained to see them as community members deserving of respect and protection. The suspicious person calls that had led to Tyler's shooting were now handled with requirements for specific, articulable reasons for police intervention. Robert had used his experience and military connections to establish the Tyler Williams Foundation for Police Accountability. The foundation provided legal support for families affected by police violence and advocated for legislative reforms at the state and federal levels. Linda served as the foundation's executive director, channeling her pain into purpose by helping other families navigate the complex process of seeking justice. The foundation's first major success came when Congress passed the Law Enforcement Accountability Act, which required all police departments to report use-of-force incidents to a national database. The legislation also provided federal funding for body cameras and civilian oversight programs. While establishing minimum standards for police training across the country, Tyler had graduated from college with a degree in criminal justice, writing his senior thesis on the need for federal oversight of local police departments. He had been accepted to law school and planned to specialize in civil rights law, following in the footsteps of the attorneys who had helped his family seek justice. "I want to be the lawyer that other families call when they're going through what we went through," Tyler explained during his graduation speech. "I want to make sure that no parent has to conduct their own investigation like my father did, and that no family has to fight the system alone when seeking accountability." The changes in Millbrook Heights had a ripple effect throughout the region. Other police departments, seeing the consequences that had befallen Morrison, Coleman, and their supervisors began implementing their own reforms. The message was clear: the days of protecting bad officers were over, and departments that failed to hold their personnel accountable would face federal intervention. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had recorded the crucial video evidence, became an advocate for community oversight of police. She organized neighborhood watch groups that focused not on being suspicious of residents, but on monitoring police interactions to ensure they remained professional and respectful. "We learned that being a good neighbor means more than just keeping our lawns neat," Mrs. Patterson said during a community meeting. "It means paying attention to how our community is being served and protected, and speaking up when we see something wrong." 2 years after the shooting, Tyler returned to the street where he had nearly died. The spot was now marked with a small memorial garden that the community had created, not as a shrine to tragedy, but as a reminder of how much could change when people refused to accept injustice. Tyler stood in the same spot where he had fallen that night, but now he was surrounded by family, friends, and community members who had supported his journey toward healing and justice. The streetlight that had illuminated his near-death experience now shone down on a young man who had transformed personal trauma into a force for positive change. "I used to have nightmares about this place," Tyler said to his father as they stood together in the memorial garden. "But now when I see it, I think about all the good that came from something so terrible. I think about the officers who are getting better training, the families who are getting justice, and the young people who can walk home safely because of the changes we helped create." Robert put his arm around his son's shoulder, proud of the man Tyler had become and the strength he had shown throughout their long fight for accountability. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Robert said. "Not just that we got justice for what happened to you, but that we helped make sure it won't happen to someone else's son." As they walked home together down the same street where Tyler's ordeal had begun, father and son knew that their fight had created something lasting. The officers who had nearly destroyed their family were in prison. The system that had protected those officers had been reformed. And most importantly, other families would have the support and resources they needed to seek justice when faced with similar tragedies. The Tyler Williams case had become more than just one family's quest for accountability. It had become a catalyst for nationwide reform that would protect countless other young people from experiencing the injustice that Tyler had survived. In the end, that legacy of change was the most powerful victory of all.